In the quiet corner of a regional museum's storage facility, a portrait dated 1898 sat gathering dust for decades. The painting showed a wealthy man in a dark suit, his expression stern and formal in the way of late Victorian portraiture. To anyone who glanced at it, this seemed like nothing more than a simple record of a life long past. The canvas measured approximately 30 inches by 40 inches, a standard size for commissioned portraits of the era. The frame itself was ornate but worn, gilded wood with decorative corners that had dulled over the years. To the casual observer, everything about this painting suggested it was just another forgettable piece from a forgettable era. The true story of this artwork was hidden beneath layers of time and old varnish. What lay under the surface would shock the art world and the public alike. It was a controversial symbol, one that was meant to stay buried forever. This is a story about how art can hide secrets for over a century, and how one careful restoration brought a forbidden history back into the light. The portrait arrived at the conservation studio after Valerie, the museum's senior curator, requested a routine inspection. The painting had been catalogued simply as Portrait of a Gentleman, with minimal documentation about its origins or the identity of its subject. Years of aged shellac had darkened the canvas considerably, making it difficult to appreciate whatever artistic merit it might have originally possessed. Several small abrasions marked its surface, likely the result of careless handling during various moves over the decades. The painting had been donated to the museum in 1967 by the estate of a collector who had acquired it at an auction in the 1940s. Beyond that, the trail went cold. Valerie assigned the work to Hallie, the lead conservator known for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to coax surprising results from seemingly hopeless cases. The goal seemed straightforward enough: remove the old varnish, stabilize the canvas, repair the minor damage, and return the portrait to storage in better condition than it had arrived. Nobody expected what would happen next. The painting seemed destined to return to obscurity after a brief moment of professional attention. Hallie began her work in the conservation studio on a cool autumn morning. She started testing various solvents on tiny sections of the portrait's surface, documenting each reaction carefully in her lab notebook. This preliminary phase was crucial because different varnishes and paint compositions required different treatment approaches. Using the wrong solvent could damage the original paint irreparably. During this initial examination, she noticed something unusual. A small area on the subject's left lapel showed an unusually thick buildup of material. When she examined it under magnification, the texture felt different under her tools, denser than the surrounding paint. The brushwork in that area also seemed inconsistent with the rest of the portrait. This suggested something more deliberate than simple aging or environmental damage. It looked like an overpainting, a later addition meant to cover something beneath. Hallie had seen this kind of alteration before in her career. Sometimes paintings were modified to hide damage, to update clothing styles, or to remove controversial elements. Each case told a different story. She immediately contacted Valerie with her findings. What had begun as a simple restoration task was about to become a full-scale investigation. Something was hidden in this portrait, and they were about to expose it. The process of removing the overpaint required extreme patience and precision. Hallie used a specialized microscalpel along with custom solvent mixtures that she adjusted constantly based on the paint's response. She worked in sessions no longer than 2 hours to maintain absolute focus and prevent errors caused by fatigue. The work had to be done under strong magnification, removing layers that were sometimes only micrometers thick. She documented every stage with detailed photographs, creating a visual record of the revelation process. The initial removal revealed a shape beneath the layer of dark oil paint. As more of the covering came away, the shape became clearer and more defined. It was a symbol, carefully woven into the fabric of the man's coat in the original painting. The symbol appeared to be an emblem or insignia, rendered in striking detail by the original artist. It featured geometric patterns arranged in a specific configuration that suggested organizational symbolism. Once fully uncovered, Halley photographed it from multiple angles under different lighting conditions and sent the images to Renly, a historian specializing in late 19th century political movements and iconography. Renly identified the symbol within hours of receiving the photographs. It was the insignia of a radical political group known in historical records as the Brotherhood of Industrial Reformation. This organization had a short but explosive history in the late 1890s, advocating extreme views on wealth redistribution and the complete restructuring of industrial society. The Brotherhood operated openly between 1895 and 1902, attracting members from unexpected social classes. Their membership included not just laborers and activists, but also intellectuals, minor aristocrats, and even some wealthy individuals who felt guilty about their privilege or feared future revolution. The group published manifestos, held public meetings, and actively recruited new members throughout Europe and parts of North America. However, in 1903, the newly formed Federal Security Council issued a decree dissolving the organization and declaring it a threat to public order. The catalyst was a series of violent incidents, though historians still debate whether Brotherhood members were actually responsible or whether the events were used as a convenient pretext for suppression. The symbol became forbidden overnight. Possession of any document, image, or object bearing the insignia was made illegal, with penalties including imprisonment and seizure of property. Renly sent Valerie a detailed report with historical context and urged immediate further investigation. The implications were staggering. The portrait had been painted in 1898, a time when the Brotherhood was active but not yet banned. The man in the painting had worn their symbol openly, or at least openly enough to have it included in his formal portrait. This was a bold statement, a public declaration of affiliation that must have raised eyebrows even at the time. But sometime between 1903 and his death, someone had ordered the symbol covered. This was no accident of aging or damage. This was deliberate concealment, an intentional act to erase evidence of an association that had become dangerous. The overpainting was a clear sign of self-preservation, an attempt to rewrite history on canvas and protect a reputation that would otherwise be destroyed. The question remained, who had ordered the alteration, and what had happened to the man in the portrait? Valerie knew they needed more information to tell the complete story. She contacted Kalani, the museum's senior archivist, and asked her to search for any records related to the portrait's origins. Kalani dove into the museum's acquisition files and began tracing the painting's provenance backward through time. She contacted auction houses, examined old catalogs, and followed leads through correspondence files. After 3 days of intensive searching through dusty ledgers and yellowed documents, she found something remarkable. Buried in a box of miscellaneous papers that had been misfiled decades earlier was a ledger from the studio of the original painter, an artist identified in the records as Master Emerson. The ledger contained detailed entries for commissions completed between 1895 and 1905, including client names, prices, and occasionally notes about special requests or complications. The entry for the 1898 portrait included a cryptic note written in faded ink in the margin. Paid extra for revision after the first hanging per client request, March 1904. This confirmed everything. The overpainting was not done by a later owner or an overzealous restorer trying to fix perceived damage. It was a commissioned cover-up, a secret transaction designed to erase history from the canvas. The timing was perfect. Just 1 year after the Brotherhood was banned, the client had returned to the artist and paid to have the dangerous symbol hidden. With this evidence in hand, the team began piecing together the life of the man in the portrait. Vincent, a researcher specializing in industrial history and business records of the late 19th century, took on the task of identifying the subject. Using fashion details visible in the painting, the style of the artist's work, and the timing of the commission, Vincent cross-referenced the information with business directories, society records, and newspaper archives from the period. The search took several weeks, but Vincent eventually identified the subject as a prominent financier and factory owner who had profited enormously from textile manufacturing during the industrial boom of the 1890s. The man had investments in multiple factories across 3 different regions, operations that were known for harsh working conditions and extremely low wages. Contemporary accounts described workers, including children, laboring 12 to 14 hours per day in dangerous environments. The man had publicly defended these practices as necessary for economic progress and competition. He represented exactly the kind of wealthy industrialist that the Brotherhood of Industrial Reformation opposed in their public rhetoric and private organizing efforts. The hypocrisy was stunning and raised profound questions about motivation and belief. Here was a man who built his fortune on the backs of laborers while secretly aligning himself with a movement that claimed to fight for those same workers. He was playing both sides, perhaps believing in the Brotherhood's ideals while being unable to separate himself from the source of his wealth, or perhaps using the association as a form of insurance against future social upheaval. Maybe he thought that by joining the movement he could influence it toward moderation or protect himself if revolution actually came. Whatever his true motivations, the symbol on his coat revealed a dangerous contradiction. When the government cracked down in 1903, that contradiction became a legal liability that could cost him everything. The man or his family had moved quickly to hide the evidence, returning to the artist and paying for the alteration that would preserve the portrait while erasing its most controversial detail. River, a cultural anthropologist brought in to consult on the project, offered additional context that helped the team understand the broader social landscape. River explained that the years around 1900 were marked by extreme social tension across Europe and the Americas. Rapid industrialization had created unprecedented wealth for some while leaving millions in poverty. Labor movements were growing stronger and more militant. Governments were terrified of revolutionary movements, seeing threats everywhere and responding with increasingly harsh suppression tactics. Anyone associated with banned organizations faced not just legal consequences but complete social ruin. Families could lose their standing in society. Their businesses could be boycotted or seized, and their reputations built over generations could be destroyed overnight. Children and grandchildren of known radicals found themselves excluded from schools, clubs, and marriage prospects. The decision to overpaint the symbol was not just about avoiding prosecution. It was about protecting descendants from shame and financial collapse. River noted that many families went to extraordinary lengths to erase evidence of controversial affiliations during this period. Documents were burned in fireplaces, letters were destroyed, family histories were rewritten, and, as this case showed, even paintings were altered. The portrait became a document not just of one man's choices, but of the fear that gripped an entire era. As word of the discovery spread within the museum and eventually to local media, controversy erupted. The museum's board of trustees called an emergency meeting to discuss how to handle the situation. Emiliano, the board chairman and a retired corporate executive, argued strongly that the symbol should be covered again. His position was that the museum's role was to preserve objects as they existed in their known historical state. Since the painting had existed with the overpaint for over a century, that concealment was itself part of the object's history and should be respected. Covering the symbol again would preserve the evidence of the cover-up while respecting the wishes of the original family, who clearly wanted the association hidden. Hallie and Valerie were invited to present the conservator's perspective at the board meeting. Hallie argued that conservation ethics required revealing the original artist's work whenever possible. The overpaint was not part of the artist's vision or original creation. It was a later alteration made under duress, a form of censorship imposed on the artwork. To restore it would be to perpetuate that censorship and deny the public access to historical truth. The debate grew heated over the following weeks. Jace, another board member with a background in constitutional law, raised concerns about the museum taking a political stance by revealing the symbol. He worried about public reaction and potential backlash from groups who might see the display as either glorifying or condemning radical politics. The museum could find itself in the middle of contemporary political debates about wealth inequality, labor rights, and social movements. Archer, representing the museum's education department, countered that the painting's educational value lay precisely in its complexity. This was an opportunity to teach about political fear, social pressure, and how history gets hidden and revised. The painting could spark important conversations about honesty, courage, and the responsibility to preserve difficult truths. The board remained divided for weeks, with members dug into opposing positions. The portrait sat in the conservation lab, partially cleaned, the symbol visible but the painting incomplete, trapped between two possible futures. Staff members began taking sides, and the internal debate occasionally spilled into tense hallway conversations. The deadlock finally broke when Lorenzo, a visiting historian from a prestigious university, weighed in with a detailed analysis. Lorenzo had been invited to examine the portrait as part of an unrelated research project on industrial-era art and labor representation. After studying the painting and reviewing all the evidence that had been gathered, Lorenzo presented a compelling argument to the board at a specially convened meeting. He stated that the overpainting itself was the most important historical evidence the portrait contained. The original symbol showed the man's affiliation in 1898, a fascinating but relatively simple historical fact. But the deliberate concealment showed the terror and political climate of 1903 and the years that followed. It revealed how fear operated, how people tried to rewrite their own histories, and how political suppression affected private lives. The full painting, with its story of alteration now known and documented, told a two-part narrative. It captured both the moment of bold association and the moment of frantic denial. Lorenzo argued that by revealing the symbol but fully documenting the cover-up through detailed labels, conservation reports, and educational materials, the museum could preserve both truths simultaneously. The painting would become not just a portrait of one man, but a document about how fear shapes what we choose to remember and what we choose to hide. The board voted to accept Lorenzo's recommendation by a narrow margin. Halley completed the conservation work over the following month, removing all of the overpaint and stabilizing the original surface beneath. The Brotherhood insignia, hidden for more than 120 years, was visible once again in all its original detail. The museum commissioned new research into the subject's life, bringing in additional historians and genealogists. They uncovered business records, personal correspondence, and even a diary entry where the man expressed conflicted feelings about wealth and justice. In one particularly revealing passage, he wrote about feeling trapped between his conscience and his circumstances, suggesting genuine internal struggle rather than simple hypocrisy. These materials were compiled into a comprehensive exhibition that opened 6 months after the restoration was completed. The portrait hung as the centerpiece, accompanied by detailed explanations of its creation, its alteration, and its rediscovery. Educational panels explained the Brotherhood's history, the political climate of the era, and the conservation process itself. Visitors learned not just about one man's secret, but about an entire society's struggle with political dissent, legal suppression, and historical memory. The response exceeded all expectations and surprised even the exhibition's most enthusiastic supporters. Scholars from multiple disciplines requested access to study the painting and the associated documents. Art historians wanted to understand the technical aspects of the overpainting. Political scientists were interested in the mechanisms of political suppression. Sociologists examined the case as an example of how families manage stigma and shame. Other museums began examining their own collections for similar instances of political censorship hidden in plain sight. 2 more portraits were discovered with comparable alterations, both connected to the same political movement, and 3 additional cases emerged involving different band organizations. The case sparked a broader conversation about what museums preserve and what they reveal. Art conservators began sharing stories of other discoveries where restorations had uncovered hidden messages, symbols, and changes made under pressure. Professional conferences devoted entire sessions to the ethical and practical challenges of revealing concealed content. The 1898 portrait became famous not for the man it depicted, but for what it represented about the relationship between art, politics, and fear. Looking back at the painting now, fully restored and properly understood, its power lies in what was almost lost forever. The symbol on the coat was nearly destroyed by silence and shame, casualties of political fear and social pressure. The original artist's careful work was hidden beneath a layer of fear-motivated alteration. The man in the portrait tried to erase a part of his own history, believing that concealment would protect his legacy and his family's future. Instead, the attempted erasure became the most revealing part of his story, the detail that transformed a simple portrait into a complex historical document. The painting stands as proof that truth has a way of surviving, even when buried under layers of denial and deliberate forgetting. It took careful hands, patient research, and the courage to ask difficult questions. But the forbidden symbol finally saw light again. This portrait's journey from simple society picture to complex historical document raises important questions that extend far beyond one painting or one museum. How many other truths remain hidden in museum storage rooms, archives, and private collections around the world? What other stories have been deliberately erased or altered because they became inconvenient or dangerous to someone? Every historical object carries layers of meaning, and sometimes the most important layer is the one someone tried to remove. Art can be a record keeper, but it can also be a victim of censorship. The 1898 portrait reminds us to look closer, to question what appears simple, and to remember that history is not just what people chose to show, but also what they desperately tried to hide. In museums and archives around the world, there are likely hundreds of similar secrets waiting to be discovered by someone curious enough to look beneath the surface. Each one represents a choice made in fear, and each one deserves to be brought back into the light where it can teach us something true about the past and perhaps about ourselves.